It was night when Angela pushed the door shut and dropped her bag on the floor. Her feet ached as if they had carried the weight of the entire world, and her body begged for bed. "Ethan," she called, expecting to hear the familiar coming. "Mom." That was always followed by quick footsteps. But the silence, that silence wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. She climbed the stairs, nearly stumbling, opening doors like someone searching for air to breathe. His room empty, the kitchen only the clock marking time, the living room the same mess from the morning, but no sign of life. It was like walking into a movie and realizing the main character had vanished from the script. And when the one missing is your child, every second stretches out like an endless hallway. Her heart began to run before her legs did. And when the heart runs, it drags the mind along. 1,000 possibilities, none of them comforting. Is he at the neighbors, playing outside? Was there an accident? Questions that came and went without an answer. It's incredible how the mind, in moments like this, turns into a writer of tragedies. Until instinct spoke louder. Ask. The one who always sees everything, Mr. Thompson. The man across the street who never misses a thing from his window appeared with a furrowed brow. He said he had seen a CPS vehicle, Child Protective Services, taking the boy. His voice carried no gossip, only the weight of bad news, the kind that's told carefully. It was as if someone had turned off all the lights inside Angela. Reality was no longer a suspicion, it now had an address and a name. And here's the thing. Life doesn't send a warning when it decides to change direction. If you've ever lost something valuable, a job, a friend, an opportunity, you know the first reaction is denial. But denial doesn't bring anything back. What does is acting fast, even when you're scared. And to act sometimes, you need to run with your soul before you even move your feet. Angela did run, but not home. She went straight to the CPS office. And there was the door, locked cold, with a sign that seemed to mock her. Open 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Can you imagine? Her world was falling apart at 8 at night, but the system had already gone to sleep. That's the kind of moment that teaches you. Personal pain doesn't work on business hours, but institutions do. That night was the longest of her life. There was no sleep, only waiting. And waiting when it's for someone you love isn't just hours passing on. The clock it's an invisible prison. The apartment walls seemed to close in. Every shadow reminded her of what wasn't there. And the worst part, there was no phone picking up, no door opening. Only the certainty that tomorrow had to come fast. It's funny how, in moments like these, we try to bargain with time. If morning comes soon, maybe it will be fixed. But time doesn't bargain, just moves at its own pace, in its own way. Angela knew that when the sun rose, she'd have to face something she'd never imagined. It wouldn't just be about bringing Ethan back. It would be about facing a system that often can't see the heart behind the mistakes. And here's the hook. Have you ever asked yourself what you'd do if, overnight, you had to prove you're capable of caring for the thing you love most? That's when Angela and Ethan's story stops being about a single night of silence and starts being about facing a courtroom where justice doesn't always mean fair. The sun had barely risen when Angela arrived at the CPS door, holding a cheap coffee that looked more like tinted water. She hadn't slept, but she didn't feel sleepy, only that strange mix of anxiety and fear. When her name was finally called, there was Ethan, sitting on a plastic chair, eyes lost. The moment he saw her, he ran, and their hug was the kind that squeezes your soul. It's a kind of hug no one should ever have to give, just to remember the value of being together. They stayed, like that, pressed against each other, for a time that couldn't be measured in minutes. The smell of cheap shampoo in his hair, his small hand gripping her blouse. Everything said, "Don't leave me here." It's funny how, in moments like that, you realize love isn't pretty poetry on social media. Love is presence. It's skin. It's a look that speaks without a word. But in the middle of that reunion came the paper, the neglect petition. The document was blunt, almost cruel. Child left alone after school, safety risk. No line about the 12-hour shifts. No mention of the effort to pay rent and keep food on the table. It was as if their entire story had been reduced to half a dozen cold words. If you've never been judged by an out-of-context snapshot, you might not understand. But Angela knew fighting this would be like swimming against a riptide. The worker explained, without much tact, that there would be a shelter hearing within, at most, 72 hours. A hearing to decide if Ethan would stay with her or be placed in foster care. And here's a piece of advice. When the system gives you a deadline, you can't afford to wait. It's like holding a lit machew. Either use it now or it burns out. Angela needed to turn every minute into strategy. She left with a knot in her stomach and a mental list. Who could help? What evidence to gather? Where to find support? It's interesting how, in times of crisis, mental clarity doesn't come from comment, comes from urgency. It's your body saying, move. And for many, the difference between losing and getting something back lies in acting before fear freezes you. Back on the street, holding Ethan's hand, she felt the urge to promise him everything would be okay. But here's the truth. No one likes to hear you can't always promise what you don't control. So instead of promising, she said, I will fight. And sometimes, that's all someone needs to stay standing, knowing there's at least one person willing to fight for them until the end. While waiting for the bus, Angela looked at her son and noticed something that cut deep. He was far too quiet. A child too quiet isn't peace, it's fear. And that fear wasn't just his, it was hers too, hidden beneath the determination. This is where many get it wrong. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding to move forward with fear sitting in the passenger seat. The ride home was silent. There wasn't much to say, and maybe if there was, the words would taste bitter. When she opened the apartment door, Angela already knew that place, as much as it was their home, was now marked by risk. And what is a home after all? When at any moment they can take away the person who matters most? And it was exactly in that thought that a new understanding began to form, almost without her noticing that this fight would not be won with emotion. Alone, it would take strategy, allies, and evidence so strong that even the coldest judge would have a hard time ignoring it. But as she would soon find out, the system is a machine now, and machines don't have hearts. The courtroom didn't feel like a place of justice. It felt like a hospital hallway where everyone already knew the diagnosis before hearing from the patient. Angela walked in, clutching the folder with the few documents she'd managed to gather while Ethan stayed with the assistant out in the hall. The air smelled of stale air conditioning mixed with burnt coffee, and in the background, a line of cases being treated like numbers. The coldness of the system isn't something you can explain. It's something you feel on your skin. The judge, a white man with an impatient stare, called the case. His tone said more than his words. There was no time for stories, only 4 decisions. Here's an uncomfortable truth: when the system is in a hurry, it doesn't see people. It sees problems to be fixed quickly. Angela, even without understanding every legal term, realized she was in a game where the other team was already winning before the first whistle next to her. The Galtha guardian, ad litem, the legal representative for Ethan's best interest, a CASA worker, were already flipping through papers, like they'd already made up their minds. It's strange watching people decide the future of someone they've never seen smile, cry, or sleep peacefully. But that's how the machine works. It runs on reports, not memories. The hardest moment was hearing the initial recommendation that Ethan remain in state custody until the main hearing. That meant more days apart, more empty nights, more fear for both of them. It's like someone putting your life on pause without asking if you agree. Angela knew that with each passing day apart, their bond would be tested in, that regaining that space later would be even harder. Visits, they said, would be supervised. And here's something important. Supervised visits aren't normal visits. They're almost disguised interviews. Every word, every gesture is observed, noted, and later used as evidence. It's like playing with your child, knowing that every laugh is being graded on an invisible scorecard. Angela tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like inhaling heavy air. The prosecutors spoke of risk, neglect, and protection as if they were chess pieces. Beautiful words that in practice meant separation. She knew that to turn this around, she'd have to show she wasn't a careless mother, but a woman paying the price for holding her household together alone. And this is where many get it wrong, thinking the court wants to hear emotional stories. No, it wants concrete evidence. Photos, reports, witnesses. The machine doesn't move by what you feel. It moves by what you prove. And that was the scariest part for Angela. How do you turn love into something that fits on an official document? The judge's gavel came down on the provisional decision. Ethan would remain in state custody until the next hearing. Angela didn't cry there. She'd learned that in front of the machine. Tears don't oil the gears, only slow the next step. And the next step would be preparing an arsenal of proof to show beyond a doubt that Ethan was safer in her arms than anywhere else. Walking out of the room, she realized this wasn't just a custody fight. It was a duel against a massive gear that grinds down those who don't understand how it turns. And to fight a machine, you can't rely only on strength. You need to understand its rules, its shortcuts, and its flaws. The problem was, in her case, time was short, and the lawyer hadn't even stepped in yet. The money was tight. Angela sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread out, calculating what she could cut to try and hire a lawyer. Every number seemed to shout, "You can't." But giving up wasn't an option. When she finally called the lawyer she'd been referred to, the response was blunt. "I don't take cases like this for that low a fee." It felt like taking a punch without warning. Angela took a deep breath and insisted. She told her about the 12-hour shifts, about her 9-year-old son who loved math, about how she only needed a chance to prove she wasn't the mother the report described. On the other end of the line, an uncomfortable silence, until the lawyer, somewhat reluctantly, said, "All right, I'll see what I can do." Sometimes persistence opens doors that money can't. At their first meeting, the lawyer, Ms. Carter, was direct. "We're going to need solid evidence, and fast." Solid evidence, in the language of the system, meant documents, records, witness statements, nothing emotional. And here's a truth, as unfair as it seems. What saves you in court isn't how much you love, it's how much you can prove. Angela began gathering letters from her employer confirming her shifts, school reports showing Ethan was doing well, and testimony from Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor who always checked in on him after school. Everything seemed promising, until the lawyer found a roadblock. An old social worker's report, warning of a possible risk months earlier, that would weigh against her. It was the first time Angela understood that, in court, the past and present blend as if they're the same thing. It's as if one mistake or something interpreted as a mistake has eternal validity. And the cruelest part is that past often doesn't tell the full story. Who hasn't been judged for a single moment without anyone asking what happened before or after? Ms. Carter decided they'd need something stronger. A safety plan. A plan showing that if Ethan came back home, there would be constant supervision. This meant having alternative caregivers after school, emergency contacts, and, if needed, unannounced CPS visits. It was a risky move, but better than waiting passively. Angela called every person she could trust. Some didn't answer, others made excuses, but a few said, "Count on me." It's striking how, in times of need, people split into those who disappear and those who become part of your story. And for Angela, those few voices of support would make all the difference as she gathered evidence. She began to realize this fight wasn't just against the system, it was against time itself. The main hearing was approaching, and each day brought a new document to track down, a signature to collect, a call to return. It was a marathon, but with the finish line hidden. When the folder finally felt heavier than when she started, Angela knew there was still much to do. But at least now she had someone by her side who spoke the court's language and knew which doors to knock on. The next challenge. Turning that stack of papers into a narrative strong enough to pierce the judge's cold armor. Angela's folder was starting to gain weight not just from paper, but from meaning. Every paycheck, every school report, every paid bill receipt was like a small piece of a puzzle that needed to be complete before the hearing. She knew that court didn't want to hear about sleepless nights or how hard it was to raise Ethan alone. What mattered was what could be shown, signed, and stamped. Ms. Carter instructed, "We need dates, times, records. Everything." That meant digging through drawers, boxes, old folders, even the bottoms of forgotten handbags in the closet. Angela even found old messages exchanged with Mrs. Johnson, arranging for her to pick Ethan up from school when her shift ran late. Every detail was gold. In court, even a small piece of evidence is still evidence. Beyond the documents, the lawyer asked for something crucial: a strong safety plan. A plan that would clearly show, on paper, exactly how Ethan would be cared for every day after school until she came home from work. It was like building a military schedule, but for real life. Who would pick him up? Who would stay with him? Who would make sure he had dinner and did his homework? Angela called neighbors, co-workers, even a distant cousin. Many avoided the responsibility, but some said yes. It's interesting how in these moments people reveal themselves. It's not about quantity, it's about who's truly willing to put their name on a list and say, "I'll take this responsibility." Amid the paperwork, Ethan appeared holding a drawing. Him and his mom holding hands, with a huge sun behind them. "Can I put this in the folder too?" he asked. Angela smiled and said yes. The judge wouldn't accept it as evidence. But for her, that paper said more about safety and love than any official report. Evidence gathering became routine. Morning meant work, evening meant papers. Angela began to notice that each document had a story on. Telling that story in an organized way could make the difference. It wasn't enough to hand over loose papers. She had to create a narrative showing that every action she took had purpose and care behind it. Ms. Carter reviewed everything with eagle eyes. "This helps, this doesn't, this is great, so we'll save for the end." Angela understood it wasn't just about collecting evidence, but knowing how and when to present it. In court, even the order of things matters. Like a chess game, you don't just need the right pieces, you need to move them at the right time. With the safety plan almost finished, Angela felt for the first time that she had something solid in her hands. A document showing that Ethan would have supervision, support, and safety. But she knew that even so, the decision wasn't guaranteed. The system's machine, as she had already learned, doesn't move solely on logic. It has its own invisible gears, and with that mix of hope and caution, Angela closed the folder that night. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to face the most intense day of her life. The trial. The way each piece was placed on the table could decide whether she would walk back home with Ethan or alone. The courtroom was more crowded than Angela expected. Chairs creaked when someone shifted, and the low murmur of voices mixed with the dry sound of papers being turned. She walked in, holding her folder like a shield. In the hallway, she had promised herself she wouldn't let fear show. The moment she saw the judge, her breath grew shorter. The judge, a white man with a stern face, seemed to be in a hurry. Before Angela could even speak, he cut her off with accusations: negligence, recklessness, and disorder. Each word landed like an invisible stamp, and the sound echoed in her chest. Strange how sometimes those who judge already build the sentence before hearing the whole story. The prosecution and CPS presented their case. They showed reports, repeated phrases Angela already knew by heart, but spoken there, they seemed to carry a crushing weight. They spoke as if Ethan were just a statistic to be protected, not a 9-year-old boy who loved to draw and tell jokes at breakfast. The coldness of their words was almost an insult to the life they actually had. Ms. Carter stood up. Firmly, she showed that Angela worked to support her son, that she often took him to work, and that the neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, kept an eye on him. Each point was presented as a piece of a larger puzzle. A mother trying to balance responsibilities in a system that doesn't make it easy for those who are alone. The judge, curt and sharp, cut her off. Love does not replace proper supervision. It was like hearing someone say effort had no value. Angela kept her head high, but inside she felt the blow. That's the cruelty of court. It measures care with a bureaucratic ruler, not with the heart. Ms. Carter pressed on, highlighting Ethan's school record, his lack of disciplinary issues, the community's support, and the possibility of alternative measures. Angela looked at her son, sitting with the assistant a few meters away, and thought about how many things they had already overcome together. But this battle was different. The battlefield was the courtroom itself. the silence before the judge's final words was heavy. He flipped through papers, made notes, and didn't look at Angela as he said he would remove custody and keep Ethan in state care. The words came with the coldness of a sentence read mechanically, without emotion, as if they were talking about property and not the bond between mother and son. Angela felt her legs weaken but didn't move. Not yet. She knew that sometimes the last lifeline appears at the most unlikely moment, and that to turn around a nearly lost game, you have to act in the exact second the chance appears. And it was in that thread of desperation and courage that she prepared to do something that could completely change the course of that hearing. The sound of the judge's gavel was like a thunderclap splitting the air. Custody will be removed, and the child will remain under state care. The words echoed through the room like a verdict with no appeal. For a moment, Angela was frozen, as if her body refused to accept what her mind had just heard. Then her legs gave way. She fell to her knees, not in defeat, but because the weight of losing Ethan was heavier than any posture could hold. "Please, Your Honor, please don't do this. He's all I have," she pleaded, her voice choked, but still steady. Her hands clutched the folder against her chest as if it were her child himself. The room fell silent. Not even the scratching of pens dared to continue. Every word she spoke seemed to tear through the heavy air of the courtroom. The judge, a man with an impenetrable expression, leaned back slowly in his chair, fingers interlaced on the desk. He looked at Angela the way someone might look at a request they had decided against long before it was spoken. "Stand up, Mrs. Walker. The court has already ruled." "Worth." His words were icy, but worse was the look in his eyes, a mix of boredom and condescension. Angela stayed on the floor, breathing deeply, eyes brimming but refusing to let a single tear fall. "If working to feed my son is my crime, then give me the sentence. Oh, but let me raise my boy." Her voice didn't shake. It came out as if she knew this might be her last chance to be heard. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, and even the CPS representative looked away. The judge let out a faint sigh, as if irritated at having to explain the obvious. "Love does not replace proper supervision," he repeated, this time more slowly, as if it were a lesson she had failed to learn. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sentence like a blunt blow. But when she opened them, there was something different. No longer just desperation, but a force ready to act. The atmosphere hung suspended, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. The judge adjusted his papers, ready to close the case. But before he could bring the gavel down again, a sound from the courtroom door cut through the tension. Angela lifted her face, still on her knees, her eyes locking on the entrance. Something or someone was about to change everything. The courtroom door opened slowly, as if the moment itself wanted to announce that something important was about to happen. A beam of light cut through the room, slicing the dimness and illuminating the dust suspended in the air. Angela, still on her knees, turned her head to see who was entering. Her heart pounded not from certainty of what she'd see, but from the instinct that she was no longer alone. Not one, but 18 people walked in. Familiar faces, some tired, others resolute. They were neighbors, co-workers, people who shared sidewalks, grocery lines, and sometimes even hardships with Angela. They came not just as a physical presence, but carrying a cause. The room, once cold, now held a silent warmth that didn't come from temperature. The judge's brow furrowed, annoyed. "What is this?" he asked, his tone sharp, the voice of someone who doesn't like surprises. A tall man in a plain shirt stepped forward. "Your Honor, we ask permission to speak." There was no hesitation in his voice, only the steady conviction of someone carrying more than papers. He was carrying a solution. In his hands was a detailed schedule, times, names, responsibilities. Who would pick Ethan up from school, who would stay with him until Angela got home, who would ensure dinner and homework were done. Each task came with a name and a phone number. This wasn't just goodwill, it was organization. Proof that the community knew how to care for one of its own. The packet included signed statements, copies of IDs, contact numbers for verification, background checks already in progress. There was even a letter from Angela's employer offering a shift change, and another from the school confirming a spot in the after-school program. It was as if each person had brought a brick to rebuild. The home the system was trying to tear down. The silence in the room was no longer cold, but expectant. Even the CPS representative, used to hearing empty promises, leaned in to examine the documents more closely. It was hard to find a reason to say no when the solution was laid out so clearly. Angela, still on her knees, felt a wave of gratitude, and disbelief surged through her. The judge looked at the documents, then at the group, and back to Angela. He didn't speak, but his gaze seemed to measure just how far this network of support was willing to go. It was a silent chess game. The next move wouldn't be his alone. It would be shaped by what this moment represented. Ms. Carter, quick to act, seized the opening. Your Honor, this is evidence that there are viable measures to keep the child with the mother without any safety risk. The law requires reasonable efforts before removal. Her tone was firm, but she knew that right now, there's something stronger than any legal argument: the living presence of the community. Angela hugged the folder tighter to her chest and lifted her eyes to the judge. For the first time in this hearing, she didn't feel alone before the machine. But she knew she hadn't won yet. The next minute would decide whether this collective effort would be a victory or just another story of resistance left unfinished. Ms. Carter didn't waste a second. With a steady gesture, she approached the judge's bench and, in a firm voice, invoked the law. Your Honor, the state is required to make reasonable efforts before removing a child from the home. The presence of this support network proves that alternative measures are viable. This wasn't just legal rhetoric. It was a statement weaving law and humanity into the same thread. The judge, sitting upright, slowly flipped through the schedule presented. With each page turned, the silence in the room grew heavier. He knew the law obligated him to consider alternatives. But knowing and admitting are different verbs, and his expression still hovered between authority and reluctance. The CPS representative cleared his throat before speaking. If, only if, all names pass background checks, and the schedule is followed precisely, we can accept that this plan meets the necessary supervision requirements. It was said like a mix of warning and concession, but to Angela, it sounded like the first crack of light after a sleepless night. The gal Casa, the child's court-appointed advocate, stood to speak. Your Honor, the priority is to keep the child with their mother whenever safety allows. This plan meets the requirements and preserves the bond. It was like hearing an unexpected witness strengthen her side of the story. Angela kept her gaze down, but her heartbeat had changed rhythm. The judge closed the folder slowly, as if intentionally prolonging the moment. Considering the law and the material presented, I grant the stay of the removal order and approve the continuance. The words echoed, heavy with formality, but to Angela, they were almost music. It wasn't full victory yet, but it was reclaimed ground. He read the conditions aloud: unannounced CPS home visits, mandatory attendance for Ethan in the after-school program, alternating supervision from approved neighbors, a parenting course for Angela, and weekly check-ins with the court. It was a sentence of vigilance, but one that kept Ethan at home. Angela clutched the folder to her chest and took a deep breath. When she looked at Ethan, she saw in his eyes the mix of relief and exhaustion she felt herself. He might not understand all the legal terms, but he understood the essential. He was going home with his mother. The community behind her began exchanging quiet smiles, like people who knew the game wasn't over but could feel the scoreboard turning. Even the judge, though impassive, seemed aware that this decision had been swayed not only by law, but by the strength of the people standing there. Angela, still seated, felt the energy shift. This wasn't the end of the battle, but for the first time in a long time, she could tell herself, today the system heard me. The next step would come quickly, and this time, she would be ready for it. The gavel came down one last time, the sound echoing like a period in the middle of a book still open. Angela remained seated, feeling every muscle in her body both relax and tighten. Relief and anxiety mingled together. Done, the decision had been made, but the emotion felt bigger than any sentence. Her heartbeat was so loud it seemed to fill the room. Ethan stood up slowly, as if afraid to break the spell of the moment. His eyes searched for his mother's, and when they met, no words were needed. Angela opened her arms and he ran to her. Ignoring protocol and whatever formality still lingered, her embrace was firm, deep, the kind that etches itself into skin and memory. The courtroom, filled with attorneys, CPS workers, neighbors, and strangers, seemed to forget for a few seconds that it was a place of law. Some discreetly wiped away tears, others simply breathed deeply. There was a kind of victory here that couldn't be measured solely in legal terms. But in the invisible weight of having fought to the very end, Angela, still holding her son, knelt again, but this time not in despair. It was a gesture of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that she was living a moment that could have ended so differently. Ethan, eyes closed, buried his face in her shoulder, as if wanting to keep the scent and warmth of that instant forever. The judge tried to proceed with the closing, but Angela lifted her face without letting go of her son and spoke. She didn't shout, didn't tremble. Her voice came out steady, carrying a simple, non-negotiable truth. If working to feed my son is my crime, then give me the sentence and the legal chance to raise him without leaving him alone. Every syllable fell like a stone into the silence of the room. For a moment, no one breathed. Even those who had already decided against her had to face the discomfort of her words. It was impossible to hear them and not think of one's own choices, one's own judgments. Angela was not just defending herself, she was speaking for all mothers living between love and necessity. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him, perhaps to hide something he didn't want others to see. But her words had already crossed invisible walls. In the gallery, a collective sigh broke the silence, followed by a few restrained claps and a knowing glance shared among the neighbors, who had entered that room like anonymous soldiers. Back at the apartment days later, reality rearranged itself. On the refrigerator, a large calendar showed the 18 neighbors' care schedule. Beside it, a note from her employer confirming her new shift in Ethan's after-school program badge. It was a new routine, but for Angela. Every small detail was a reminder that she had won more than a case. She had won against abandonment. She kissed Ethan's forehead before turning off the light. He smiled half asleep and murmured a peaceful "Good night." Angela knew the future would still bring challenges, but in that moment, she understood something deep. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from not giving up even when everyone says you've already lost.